part of this video is sponsored by Brilliant. When you think of cheese, you think Switzerland. With name brands like Emmental and Gruyere, legendary cheeses like these have defined what Swiss means in the world of food. And then there's fondue, the cheesiest tradition of them all. It's cozy, it's nostalgic, and nothing screams Switzerland quite like dunking bread into a cauldron of molten cheese in the middle of an Alpine winter wonderland. Except, what if I told you it's all a lie, or at least a carefully crafted illusion? What if I told you that for nearly a century, a literal Swiss cheese cartel micromanaged every aspect of the Swiss cheese industry? What cheeses are allowed, who gets to make them, who gets to sell them, and at what price? All dictated by the cartel. With more government money at their disposal than even the Swiss military, they didn't just control everything cheese, they invented entire traditions. That's right, fondue isn't a tradition passed down through generations. It was one of history's most brilliant marketing campaigns designed to have the world eat as much Gruyere as possible by an all-out cartel that monopolized Swiss cheese until it all came crashing down. Let's begin the story in the 19th century, when Switzerland was the global superstar of cheese. Alpine farms churned out massive wheels of golden goodness, shipping them across the continent and the oceans. They even invented shelf-stable processed cheese, and that is a pretty big legacy. Now, back then, Switzerland was boasting hundreds, if not over 1,000 different types of cheese, and the world was well aware they were importing enormous amounts of it. Everyone was happy and well supplied with cheese, but like many food stories, everything changed with World War I. Switzerland was famously neutral and avoided widespread devastation, but there was one problem. Everywhere around them, war was raging. Their international clients worldwide found themselves entangled in military conflicts, trade disputes, and economic crises. Shipping routes laid in ruins. And countless Swiss farmers, cheesemakers, and traders were sitting on literal mountains of surplus cheese and dairy, in total panic. To avoid a massive dairy meltdown and everyone selling whatever they had for whatever money they could get, which would bankrupt the industry and wreck the country's economy, nervous Swiss officials set up what was meant to be a temporary emergency arrangement. That solution had a name, the Swiss Cheese Union, first formed in 1914. One singular organization to stabilize and oversee the entire Swiss cheese industry. How, you might ask? Well, the Swiss Cheese Union strategy was straightforward. They would purchase all milk supplies, oversee cheese production, and act as the country's sole cheese trader. This monopoly would let them control supply and maintain stable prices during the turbulent period. Their strategy did work to some extent. The market avoided total collapse and the cheese industry made it through the war. But their heavy-handed approach definitely came at a significant cost as well. Cheesemakers were instructed on precisely how they had to do their jobs and even which types of cheese were permissible. Remember the hundreds of types of Swiss cheese? No more. Now there were exactly 7. And out of those, only 2 types would make up the bulk of Swiss cheese production: Emmental and Gruyere. I think you may have heard of those. People joked about cheese communism, and while that might sound like a little bit of an exaggeration, it actually hit close to home. The union acted with the blessing and the money of the Swiss government to keep cheesemakers from sinking. They controlled nearly every facet: milk quotas, cheese varieties, export channels, and their power only expanded when the Great Depression and eventually World War II wreaked havoc around the world again. Once more, Switzerland stayed neutral. Once more, the Swiss Cheese Union kept its grip on the industry, balancing production, prices, and distribution. And once more, Switzerland's economy and cheeses survived. No wonder that by the 1950s, the union had become part of the national fabric, so ingrained that farmers and cheesemakers often took it for granted. Some of them didn't even remember a time before the union. And for a while, everything seemed perfect. Mountains, cowbells, abundant cheese, and stable incomes. It was a win-win situation. And with World War II behind them, the war-weary world showed renewed interest in enjoying life's pleasures, especially when it came with freshly imported Swiss cheese. But as we know, these booms never really last forever, and the solution the union had for the next cheese crisis was anything but ordinary. As you can tell, the history of Swiss cheese is quite complex, and when it comes to understanding complex topics, I love going to this video's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in math, data analysis, programming, and AI. Instead of just watching lecture videos, I'm actively experimenting and solving puzzles so I genuinely get the topic I'm learning about. And if you ask me, with everything going on in the world, even just in the last few weeks, there's never been a better time to truly understand on a deep level what AI is all about and how it works. And Brilliant is perfect for just that. Whether you're a beginner or more advanced, it's letting you dive deep and truly internalize the mechanisms behind the technology. So cool for someone like me who loves understanding how things work. Brilliant's approach really sharpens your problem-solving skills, and also developing a steady learning habit with Brilliant only takes a few minutes each day. Because you're actively engaging with the material, it's far more effective than just passively watching lectures. It's helping you truly retain what you learn. Ready to give it a try? Head to brilliant.org/Andong or scan the QR code for a free 30-day trial. If you decide to go premium, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. The link is in the description. Start building real lasting skills today with Brilliant. Thanks Brilliant for sponsoring this video. So, in the 1950s, the world was transitioning back to a peacetime economy. Dozens of countries that had been focused on wartime production began shifting to civilian manufacturing. Combined with advances in technology, this led to a sudden surge in global dairy and cheese supply, leaving the Swiss in a tricky position. The Union thought, well, we've already made it through a crisis or two with our methods, so we'll get through this one as well. So they continued doing their thing, waiting for markets to stabilize while pumping more and more subsidies into the system to compensate for falling incomes. But this time, things felt a little different. Things kind of started getting out of hand, and at one point the Swiss government famously spent more on cheese subsidies than on its army. And that's no small feat in a country known for defending every inch of its alpine border. And yes, these measures, they did keep struggling dairies afloat, but they also left one burning question. How do we actually get people to consume all this Swiss cheese that we're sitting on? The answer turned out to be surprisingly simple. Let's invent a new dish that uses enormous amounts of cheese, market the heck out of that dish, and then convince the world that this previously unknown Swiss tradition was the greatest thing ever. And you guessed it, this is where fondue came swaggering onto the scene. I mean, yes, the dish had previously existed in some corners of the country, in theory, but it was hardly the symbol of Swiss identity it is today. In fact, it wasn't even the same dish. It was usually made with tons of eggs, more like a soft, cheesy omelette. So really not that much resemblance to modern-day fondue other than the name. The Swiss Cheese Union, though, recognized the potential of dipping bread into tons of molten cheese as the perfect way to dispose of copious amounts of surplus Emmental and Gruyere. One pot of fondue could devour chunks of cheese by the pound, especially if you were hosting a party. So the Union went all out and launched huge marketing campaigns that made fondue look like the ultimate communal feast. Advertisements showed cozy chalets and fashionable skiers who somehow seemed to thrive solely on melted cheese with a kick of wine. Kitschy but cute fondue pots called caquelins became must-have kitchen items, and the Union's marketing managers were smart enough to give away thousands of them to spread the word. And you know, the campaign definitely caught on. If you were throwing a dinner party in the 60s and 70s, you had to have the pot, the sterno fuel, and those color-coded forks. It all felt so fun and social that nobody noticed they were effectively gobbling up the oversupply that had been haunting Swiss warehouses for years. Fondue mania spread across the globe, generating decent profits and rescuing the Swiss dairy industry from complete collapse once again. The Union was ecstatic, but in its hubris, it may just have flown a little too close to the sun. Even with the resounding success of the fondue campaign, the Swiss Cheese Union couldn't maintain its perfect image forever. Towards the end of the 20th century, Switzerland's economic pivot was becoming more and more obvious. What used to be a mostly agrarian country carried substantially by its cheese and dairy industry was now becoming a high-tech financial powerhouse. The idea of pouring what seemed like unlimited subsidy funds into one agricultural cartel started to feel, well, outdated. Meanwhile, rumors of backroom deals and embezzlement within the Union began to surface, undermining public trust in an institution once considered patriotic and essential. Suddenly, Swiss citizens and politicians alike started asking hard questions. Why were we subsidizing cheese on such a mammoth scale? And where exactly was all that money going? For like half a century, nobody really seemed to ever have checked. And once they did, jaws dropped. Some officials within the Union were caught pocketing funds or distributing payouts to favored cheesemakers. The tabloids lapped up the scandals and the courts handed down convictions. This was nothing short of a shock to a country that prided itself on integrity and order and cheese. But as discontent toward the organization grew, so did something else. there was now a newfound demand for real cheese variety. The Union no longer being the cheese dictator, farmers in different valleys wanted to revive local specialties that had been sidelined for decades, each boasting unique flavors and centuries of history. Under the Union's rules, they were expected to crank out Emmental or Gruyere, and almost nothing else. Cheesemakers who applied for licenses to make other varieties would either get a straight up 9, followed by heavy penalties if they tried anyway, or at the very least, they'd find themselves in bureaucratic purgatory, waiting for years for approval that might never come. Voters started pushing for a freer market, and once political support for the Union dried up after all the scandals, so did the subsidies and the protections it had relied upon. After roughly 80 years of dominance, the Swiss Cheese Union finally crumbled under its own weight. Despite having shaped modern Swiss cheesemaking and our global love affair with fondue, the cartel saga was coming to a dramatic end. Dairy farmers and cheesemakers suddenly found themselves in a brave new world. There were no more ironclad rules about who could produce what, no more quotas, and no more default subsidies for churning out mass quantities of the same limited varieties. And overnight, a wave of creativity swept the Alps. Local farmers resurrected obscure cheeses, from pungent blues to soft ripened rounds. As artisanal dairies flourished, Switzerland began showing off a rainbow of flavors the Union had once suppressed. Retailers overseas embraced the novelty, and cheese lovers worldwide discovered there was more to Swiss cheese than just the holy Emmental, which honestly nobody likes anyway, or the nutty Gruyere. Even fondue, once the poster child of overproduction, adjusted its place. Now more a beloved winter indulgence rather than an almost mandatory national sport. And the Swiss government didn't entirely abandon agriculture. It just shifted towards more flexible supports, allowing rural communities to adapt and evolve. Some producers formed cooperatives to market their cheeses in new ways, while others built global reputations on specialty products that reflected their unique terroir. So in quite the twist, the collapse of the cheese union brought about a revitalization that preserved both tradition and innovation. But looking back, it's tough not to marvel at how fondue became the culinary Trojan horse for clearing out excess cheese. So yeah, if you have a dusty fondue pot lurking somewhere deep in your cupboard, consider this. You are part of that grand and somewhat conspiratorial heritage. So yeah, the era of cheese communism and the Swiss Cheese Union, which has officially dissolved by now, is behind us, but Switzerland's love affair with dairy continues. Think about that next time you bite into a chunk of Swiss cheese.